Question for you. How many languages in the world are there? What makes a language? Well, there are about 7,000 languages in the world. However, 11 of them are spoken by 10 million or more people. And about 6,700 of them, 6,750 of them are spoken by 3 million or less people. So what does that look like in the world? And let's look at the types of languages here as a part of this lecture. So one thing just to notice here, language families, English and Spanish and Portuguese and French are the major languages spoken in the Western Hemisphere. And they are all part of the Indo-European language family, which we'll talk about that when we get to division of languages. But then if you go to the Eastern Hemisphere, very different picture. Eastern Hemisphere is very much more divided in terms of language families. You'll see Mandarin, which is the most language spoken in the world by the most amount of people, is Sino-Tibetan as the language family. So let's look here at languages and how the types of languages we are going to look at. So like I said, there are about 7,000 languages in the world. Languages have spread from a lot of different ways. Conquest, whether you're looking at English coming in behind the British, or Spanish moving into Spanish colonies in the New World, or relocation diffusion with migrants bringing their languages with them, or whether it's agriculture or trade, and that goes back to how Indo-European spread. So all languages within a language family can trace the roots of that language back to an ancestor, and that's the language family basically. And Indo-European is English. And so if you go back far enough, you'll find that English and German are related, or English and Dutch, or English and Swedish, or English and Farsi are related to each other if you go far enough back. And those we'll talk about more later, but I mean, how did Indo-European spread with the Indo-Europeans? Well, language or agriculture and trade. So languages over time have changed. And one of the big things to look at is an isogloss. An isogloss is a boundary between word usage. One of the most famous maps for this class is this one. Let's put the map down here. This is, what do you call that fizzy drink? Like called Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Mountain Dew. What do you call that? Do you call it pop? Do you call it Coke? Do you call it soda? The boundary usage between those words is called an isogloss, just a boundary. So, for instance, Minnesota, almost all of us call it pop. But the further east in Wisconsin you go, you could see soda. By the way, if anybody can figure out this green one up here, I know what it is just because I actually went and looked up the data of this study. Good luck figuring that out. And if you can get that for me, holy cow. And you can just see, I mean, that in general, the Midwest calls it pop. The two coasts call it soda, and the South calls it Coke. What kind of Coke do you want? I would like a Pepsi. What? Okay, but that's my thing on isoglosses. So that also then looked at dialects, which is differences in grammar, usage, and spelling. Okay? Probably the most famous dialect, or just think of a dialect as the difference in just the minute difference of the language. So American English and British English being common ones, and here you can see are a bunch of ways of how American English and British English are different. And one thing I want you to think about this is most of these happened after the American Revolutionary War. So for instance, one of the things that American English does not do is we don't include that U as much. So example, when we spell favorite or color, we don't include that U. Why don't we include the U? We don't include the U because Alfred Webster himself took it out when writing the dictionary. And this kind of a, we're not British anymore kind of thing. And actually the evidence today speaks to the fact that actually the English we speak in America today is closer to what the English was spoken in 1776 than what the British English is today. Now that leads to a question. Why isn't American English and British English a different language? Why is it just a dialect? Why is it just a dialect when there's different words for things, but we can understand, if you're speaking English, you can understand American English and British English, you can understand Australian English. Those are examples of dialect, and when you can't tell the difference anymore, it fails a test, and that's called the mutual intelligibility test. Mutual intelligibility test is if you can't tell the languages apart from each other. So, for instance, you understand English. Can you understand Spanish? You might be able to understand bits and pieces here or there, but you can't understand the whole thing. So that would tell you it's a different language. But you can, if you are understanding American English, can you understand British English? Yes. Okay. Then those are just dialects of each other. Now that can get really confusing though, and it can get really political as well. Because for instance, Norwegian and Swedish have a high level of mutual intelligibility. If you understand one, you have a decent chance to understand the other. But yet they're different languages, and that is because they were tied to different ethnic groups over time. You also have different accent pieces, and just by accent, just the way the words are used and by how they come out. So, accenting different syllables or different letters. So, like in Minnesota, we elongate our O's, Minnesota, and things like that. And then that can lead to just differences in how the language is used as well. But one thing I definitely wanted you to notice here is just when you get to the dialects pieces, it goes deep. It can go deep politically, it can go deep in terms of your identity, in terms of what language that you speak. And so in the world stage here, we are currently under what is called the rise of the lingua franca, a common language that people use who don't share a native tongue. The lingua franca are the dominant languages of the world. If you are defining lingua franca, you have to have something about economics. You have to, because it is the languages of economics throughout the world. And I put the usual ones regarded. There are English, Arabic, Spanish, French, Swahili, and Russian, and Portuguese is in there too. If you want to argue with me over the lingua franca, fine. But I mean, those are your basic languages that everybody in the world speaks in terms of economics. Now, for instance, and why isn't Mandarin included there? It should have been included there. This is me checking to make sure you're listening. That Mandarin should also be included with the lingua franca. I mean, these are the languages of the world. Now, if somebody doesn't know the lingua franca, now this is where you're going to see these next two things come into play. A pidgin language. A pidgin language is a simply mixture of the others used for trade. Spanglish. Two people, one knows Spanish, one knows English, and you're going to take a conversation, mix it together. You're looking at Spanglish. Next is a Creole language. It's a combination of two or more languages. It's more formal. A pidgin language can just be something very basic, doesn't have rules. A Creole language has come together over time. Probably the easiest example of a Creole language is Haitian Creole. It's a mixture of French, it's a little bit of English, but then also indigenous population in their language. It's got formal structure, it has everything. A Creole language grows out of and just a pidgin language over time. So let's look at some of these first, because the lingua franca are just dominant on the world stage. Here is a number of people that speak one of these languages as their native tongue. These are the most dominant languages in the world, not necessarily economically, just by sheer number of speakers. And English is by far the one most studied. That's why it's easily said that English is the world's lingua franca. English is the world's lingua franca, and it's for a lot of reasons that we'll look at in a second. India provides us a great example of this, because India of just lingua franca and language divisions and how language can work to unify a country, but at the same time work to divide. The two official languages of India are English and Hindi, but yet it has what is called 22 scheduled languages going on in India. And these 22 scheduled languages are languages that the government has to encourage use out of, whether that is Urdu, being the biggest one of them, or Telugu, or Tamil. I mean, you're looking at a bunch of different languages here. In India, gives us where you start to run into problems with an official language, one or more designated by law in the language of the government. So in America, we officially do not have an official language, and so therefore each of the states can basically decide what language they want to make things in. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. But English is the predominant language in America. And so multiple countries have multiple official languages, like Canada, with between English and French. So let's look at this map. Here's where English is dominant. Most of these, or the official language or predominant language, it's 59 countries in the world. And almost all of them can trace their roots back to either American or British imperialism / colonialism. And that is one of the main ways that English spread throughout the world, either through relocation diffusion or hierarchical diffusion. So English got its roots by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes invading what we now know as the British Isles today. Combined, those three languages basically combined, and notice that's how we also got the term Anglo-Saxon from. Those three things combine and you're looking at English basically starting to form. Then, when the Normans invade in 1066, you start to see French get in there. And then, when World War II comes, you're going to start to see some hierarchical and some relocation. So, for instance, English starts to see more of a spread into East Asia because soldiers are stationed there. English is going to start to spread also because of people wanting to be on that side of the war. And then after the war is over, pop culture. Pop culture being the dominant culture of the world today, where you're going to have just movies, entertainment, sports, etc., being broadcast in English and done in English. And the last reason why English is the world's lingua franca today is just the U.S. and the U.K. have been historically economically dominant, going back into the 1700s at this point. And that's why India, for instance, English is the official language because of those scheduled languages. Now, if you look down there in the bottom left of this slide, I have a map of the Romance languages. And one of the reasons I have that one is just to realize of how languages spread being relocation or hierarchical. All of those languages can trace their roots back to Latin. And notice the Basques are not included in that, by the way. Can trace their roots back to Latin. And some of them differ because of physical boundaries, whether that's the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain, or ethnic differences like Catalonian and Spanish, or French and Italian. So as a whole, what you should remember from this little slide here is the fact the lingua franca are getting bigger. Remember, Mandarin is included as a lingua franca. Creole language is just a more formalized version of Pidgin language. Although it's a combination of the two. You should know the definition of official languages, which I remember here. I got to show you that little slide. And you should also know the difference between an isogloss and a dialect. If the official language of a country is whatever it is, then the government has to produce everything in that language, but wouldn't have to produce everything else in that language. So no matter what your take is on this, and there's definitely some people out there who think English should be the official language of the country, and there are many people who don't. But so, for instance, here you go. This is just a look at the Minneapolis. You can see here, Minneapolis language support, and you can see here that these are the different languages that they will provide support to vote. Okay, and so this is an example of how official languages affect the country, just because the official languages. So if I type in just a street sign, now it is English because it's predominant. But if there was a spot of the country where they said no, predominant of our speakers are Spanish, we're going to make it Spanish. They could do that easily, 100%, and that would not be against national law. Where if English was the official language of the country, it would have to be in English. And so that can be a debate point between some people think English should be the official language. So something more to think about there. Do we need an official language? Should we have one? It's up to you. Think about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit in class.